Johannes Urpelainen is the Sultan bin
Abdulaziz.
Abdulaziz Chair at the School of Advanced and International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He just moved there in July. He was at Columbia before that. He and I know each other from a time we spent together at Princeton. He is an extraordinary researcher. He's been working for the past 5 or 6 years, roughly, on the energy access question, and is now, in that short period of time, regarded as one of the world's experts on that topic. Okay. And then sitting next to him is Rustam Sengupta. Rustam works on energy access as well, but from a slightly different angle. He's a social entrepreneur. He founded a social enterprise, I guess they're called, Boon, which literally means a drop of water. I've never asked him why a social enterprise that works on solar microgrids is called Boon, but he can explain that to us. Rustam has a master's in electrical engineering from UC Irvine. He has an MBA from INSEAD. He's been a fellow at Oxford, and he's been written up in a variety of publications, including Fortune magazine and so on. So he's founded Boon, which is in fact one of the best known social enterprises dealing with solar power and solar microgrids. So I thought what we could do now is, and these two have worked together. So the idea is to bring two people who have worked together in the field on questions of energy access using sort of the most current methods of empirical social science, and to start talking about the challenges, the opportunities of doing that sort of thing. Okay, so there's kind of two trends in the field of development. Those who follow development, there's two converging trends, I think. One is sort of the rise of sort of empirical social science, right? The idea of using methods from health sciences, randomized controlled trials, and so on, to try and set up field experiments to test hypotheses about questions of development. Okay? And this is, those of you who are aware of the MIT Poverty Action Lab, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, they pioneered it, and now it's pretty much the kind of major focus of development economics. Is that fair?
Yes.
Yeah. And so that approach really, in terms of energy access in the developing world, Johannes is probably the most well-known exponent of that approach. So doing empirical sciences in the field to try and understand why people use certain technologies, what sorts of incentives are at play, why people choose to use or not use certain things, and so on. So that is, sort of Johannes has been doing that for the past, better part of the past decade, and Rustam has been building those systems. Right? So Rustam has been developing both the sort of model of rolling out microgrids, but also developing technologies that are sorely needed to adapt this, solar power to the rural locations around the world. And they also have done research to work together, where Johannes, Rustam rolls out the systems, and Johannes then asks the research questions. So it's kind of, I think it's a unique opportunity to have the two of them together to talk about that. Okay, so why don't we just start, Johannes, with the examples of the types of work that you've done, and just to give people a sense for sort of what this approach is all about.
Okay, so we've done a lot of work, in particular in India, North India, focusing on the rural areas, also where Rustam works in Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, places that still have a serious energy access deficit, both in terms of electrification and access to clean cooking fuels. Some examples of projects that we've done, probably the best known and I think the most important work we've done fall under two categories. One is just systematic large-scale data collection. So if you look at a country like India, it is quite surprising to see that until the past, let's say, 3 or 4 years, there were actually very few even basic energy access surveys that were done on a large scale. So what people used to do their research and understand the situation in India was to use these general surveys like the census or the national sample survey that don't focus on energy access and just happen to have a few questions in the survey instruments and questionnaires on that. So some of the work that we did together with our Indian collaborators at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in Delhi was to do these large-scale scientifically designed surveys that specifically focus on energy access. So we collect data on electricity use, cooking practices, policy preferences, willingness to pay for modern energy, policy, the different preferences, and also perceptions of different energy technologies. This is an ongoing agenda. We did this one access survey in 2014. We are now following up with another round where we go back to the same households 4 or 5 years later, and we see how their situation has changed in different parts of India. The other side of this agenda is this experimental approaches, these randomized controlled trials, where we are basically trying to test the effectiveness of different interventions and policies. Some of them include, for example, product demonstrations. That was a collaboration with Bund a few years back, where we looked at what happens when you go to these villages and have these campaigns to advocate solar home systems, tell people about how they work, what the business model is, what you need to buy them, how much they cost, and so on. And we found a very interesting result there where the campaigns themselves were not effective unless there was an active bank manager in the local branch who was able to extend credit to these poor households. So we sort of identified really the importance of finances. Work that, by the way, nicely dovetails what some of Milind's earlier work, where they had the same result in southern parts of India using different methods. Other randomized controlled trials we've done some work evaluating the impacts of these systems. So we look both at solar lanterns and microgrids. And what we typically find is we find fairly good evidence for the energy access. So kerosene expenditures decrease, people use more energy, but we don't find evidence of this kind of dramatic economic transformation that some of the advocates of these systems were hoping for in the past. So as is often the case in development, it's kind of a mixed bag. You get some good things, you get some bad things, and hopefully in the margin it is a good thing. But it's no silver bullet, it doesn't solve all the problems. Right now we have one project that is very interesting that I personally like a lot, where we are basically mimicking or replicating the government's own policies. They have this scheme called Saubhagya. It's a Hindi word for good fortune, and what they do there is they offer heavily subsidized electricity connections to households. So we do their campaign exactly as they do it, and we test whether this approach actually results in increased electrification rates in Uttar Pradesh. And by the way, so far it does. So it seems like this is one of those cases where the government's approach is proving quite effective. In the future, we'd obviously like to do more of this. One thing that personally interests me a great deal is to move from electrification to the cooking fuel study. We haven't really done experimental work in that area, but would certainly like to do more in that space.
Rustam?
So thanks for the invitation. I actually have a video I'll play, because I think a lot of the times these conversations get very esoteric if we don't look at the product. The products are not that simple, but they're also not that complicated. And the business model, like you mentioned, actually more, I have something that drives the product. So this is a short video. It's about 4 years old. So the data is kind of old. But it shows a microgrid as we talk about it. And the area that Johannes mentioned is Uttar Pradesh. It's fairly self-explanatory, so
solar energy access company working in the states of Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh and Haryana. In Uttar Pradesh alone, we can say there are about 10 million families that live in complete dark. And when I say complete dark, I also mean they're completely cut off from any kind of economic activity after 5 or 6 p.m. because they don't have any electricity. We work in areas like those, and our primary intervention in these areas has been in the form of microgrids. Right now, we are standing in Para village, which is about 15 kilometers from the district headquarters of now. A small village with about 120 households.
carefully that I am something very nice strategy. The system includes three main components. One is the energy generation and storage system, which is about 1 kilowatt capacity and supplies power to about 40 households. The second is the central station and the energy meter. सभी वालों ने बताया कि आप बिजली लगवाइए, अच्छी रोशनी होती है, और लोगों को भेजेंगे, हमने लगवाया.
What we have central station here, from here, high voltage DC is transmitted to approximately 40 to 50 households through distribution boxes to house. In house, we install energy meter, and this steps down 96 volts DC to 4 volts DC for user consumption. These meters are prepaid and it has energy stick. This energy stick can be recharged through the central station for denomination as low as 10 rupees. The user can access energy services by plugging it back to the energy meter when he pays on per unit basis.
Through the central station, we can also log any service complaints, which can be tracked and monitored remotely through our dedicated microgrid web platform.
Microgrids monitoring system, what it does is it shows us how much load is being generated at the microgrid, how much the consumer is consuming, how much price is he paying for that much power that he is utilizing. This shows our focus on innovation and quality, and ensure that every power plant that we install is 100% reliable.
We found that people's incomes typically range between 4,000 to 10,000 rupees a month. So having them get a full connection of grid-based electricity is a huge benefit because there's none there. But even if there was, it would be significantly more expensive. Where in this case, some families spend as much as lower 60 to 70 rupees a month to get maybe 3 4 lights, mobile charging, fan, and a little access to a television kind of energy.
We believe that this is one of the most sustainable technology solutions available at the moment, and it is bound to have a disruptive impact on the energy access challenge.
और इसका सबसे बड़ा फायदा ये है कि जाते हैं ये परमानेंट 24 घंटे उपलब्ध रहती है. काम हमारा जहाँ का काम करना है हमको अभी दिन में काम कर लेते हैं, फ्लाई करते हैं, रात में भी काम कर लेते हैं.
हम लोगों को बड़ी सुविधा है, सुविधा अच्छी होती है, लाइट रहती है.
रिचार्ज वगैरह महीने का 60-70 रुपये खर्चा आता है, और जैसे ज़्यादा यूज़ करेंगे तो ज़्यादा खर्चा आएगा, जितने यूज़ करेंगे उतना ही खर्चा आएगा. इसलिए कहते हैं वो लोग आना चाहिए, फायदा है.
So our goal primarily as a company or as myself is to look at a very strong business and technical solution to something that's been acknowledged as a social problem, which even country governments or state governments actually stay away from. Three quick things that we take as the primary things to attack. Number one is affordability. And affordability is to us something that how you can break down the payments or whatever their expenditure is for energy to something that they can grasp themselves. So you saw some meters, they are all prepaid. They allow very minimal amount of money to be paid for the electricity that they get. The second thing that we targeted is reliability. The bigger problem with the Indian grid, for sure, is that even if you have a pole, it's not reliable. You don't get power or light at the time that you need it. So that's the second challenge. And the third challenge is building that amount of trust at the last mile, which has to be associated with a DISCOM. So Boond, or the company we started, is kind of like sets up these micro utility plants in multiple areas, and these plants give as it was. So one of the really good work that we've done is understanding prepaid versus postpaid also, which Johannes and his team sort of looked at whether it's better to have a fixed charge over a month, even if it's less, versus a more expensive but a prepaid charge over the time, and whether it's better in terms of the customer, also whether it's better in terms of financial sustainability of companies like ours. So we're a for-profit company. I'm not an academic at all, so I admit that first. But it's been fairly engaging to interact with Johannes and Milind and people like that to build it. So,
So I'm going to kind of do this team tag way where I ask Johannes a question and then try to use that to put Rustam on the spot and vice versa. So, so Johannes, you don't necessarily, at least in this unit, do that much. I mean, although we have people who do this sort of empirical experimental work. Be interesting to understand why do this sort of empirical work? What does it actually get you beyond the more straightforward surveys or qualitative work or observational research and so on? Why actually do this sort of empirical social science?
So I think the main motivation here is that if we only look at the data as it is, whether it's surveys that we've collected, surveys that other people have collected, administrative data, what we learn from that is basically associations between different things. So we might, for example, learn that more educated people use more modern energy. We might find that households with a lot of land are more willing to pay for solar home systems. But those findings typically don't really tell you why something is happening or what is driving different things. A good example, if I go back to the example of more educated households using more energy. So more educated households are often also wealthier. That just tends to come with the territory, especially in a country like India, where there are a lot of people who have no education at all. So is it because people are more educated, or is it because people are wealthier that they use more modern energy? Both hypotheses are plausible, but there is just no way to systematically and reliably tease that information out of the survey data. Whereas what you could do then is you could start doing some experimental work to understand it. Now, education is very hard to work with in educations. You cannot think of necessarily an intervention where you put somebody to school for 5 years and then see if they are. But money is fairly simple. People have done these experiments where they go to these households, give them money, and see if they then spend that in energy. So if you relax somebody's income constraint, give them disposable income, how much of that will they use in energy? That's a very natural experiment that will tell you a lot about the relationship between income and energy use. The other reason why I think it's important to do experiments is that they are in many ways a very practical way of doing research, because when you set up this experiment, you spend a lot of time worrying about sort of how to do this in practice. So if you have a campaign to demonstrate solar products to households, how do you design that campaign? If you don't design it well, the experiment isn't really worth anything. So you learn a lot about these kind of very practical things. If you want to evaluate the government program in an experiment, you need to understand how that government program works. How is it actually implemented? You need to dig very deep into those aspects. So some of my colleagues sometimes say that the most important lessons from these experiments are not actually the sort of statistical results that you get, but the real exposure to the reality of doing concrete work in a context like rural India, which I can tell you is going to be very different from British Columbia or Washington, D.C. or California or any other place where we usually do our work. So those, I would say, are the main motivations for why I think this kind of experimental empirical research is useful.
So you partly answered my question, you anticipated it, my next question, which is sort of one criticism of this approach, or at least criticism that I have, is that this is a tool which is like a hammer and everything then looks like a nail, right? So the classic example is this study done either in India or Kenya, where teachers were given money to test the hypotheses that basically they would show up to class if they were actually compensated in addition to their salaries. Right now, to me, that seems like that's a fairly trivial finding, but there's a lot of work that has that nature to it. So you kind of trying to verify what is pretty obvious. And the other criticism is the external validity. I mean, one reason why these things proliferate is because you can do the work in a particular location or a particular question, and then you don't know how transferable it is to another location. And so then the whole question of how do you aggregate all this knowledge together into something more coherent becomes a challenge. So any reactions to those criticisms?
On the first point, this example of giving teachers money and seeing how that influences attendance and showing up to work, I think there's two different ways of thinking these experiments. One is this very standard impact evaluation, where it actually matters, and it's not a trivial question, whether giving a teacher a $10 bonus adds up 1 hour of attendance or 2 hours, right? That is a trivial academic question in the sense that it's hard to imagine that it would not have some kind of a positive impact, right? But from a policy perspective, how positive the impact is actually very important. So people do experiments on the one hand to evaluate the impacts of policies that could be kind of important, possibly might have big effects. And then there is the other sort of maybe more academic and theoretically motivated approach, which is understanding how the world works. And if that's your goal, if you're trying to really think of more sort of generalizable knowledge, you probably would not do that experiment. You would instead do some other sort of more nuanced and interesting and challenging interventions. On external validity, this is obviously a major issue, because when we do these experiments in 1 village or 2 villages or 10 villages or 100 villages, it's not clear that that would work the same way in another state, another country. I am right now part of a project where we do 6 similar experiments in 6 different countries at the same time, using the same design, the same statistics, and so on. It's a very, very complicated project and expensive and difficult, but the hope here is to compare explicitly these interventions in different contexts and see if they actually, the lessons transform. And I think that's going to be something that people working in this impact evaluation space are going to have to do more in the future.
I'm just going to switch over to Rustam here, and I'm trying to get them to start having a dialogue.
Can I just add on to what he said from a very business perspective? I think academic research is all great and fine in terms of papers, but it has to result in some kind of commercial activity in the end, right? Some patents or some insights. I think the biggest gain we get from quantitative research of the nature that Johannes did over now that we have 5 years is very detailed quantitative insights into the consumer, which in these parts of the world is just not available. You could go to the local government and ask them, how much do people spend, what do they buy, which product do they buy. It's never going to be as consistent as running a very quantitative study to tell me exactly the right pricing point at which how many lumens of power is needed for what times of the day. And I think that's where the government has gone wrong, because they give electricity 2 hours in the afternoon and think that they've electrified, whereas really understanding what is the best use of electricity at what time, what is the amount of lumens, what is the amount of wattage that has to be delivered. So I think there is merits to actually going to a very deeper level, because that's how the commercial world works. I put my own money in every power plant. We hold equity into the power plant. I need to know whether the customer is going to pay and how much is he going to pay, what devices is he going to use. So while I can't comment on the academic merit of it, there's significant merit on the business side. On the second, to take an example of your education one, so we run a project called Light for Education, and with another gentleman from ISA, but he's in Pittsburgh, where we provide kids with solar lamps, small solar lamps, but the charging station and the central microgrid is on their school. So to use the lights at night, they have to come in the day and charge their lights. What we've noticed, first it was all anecdotal, that the kids actually start coming back to the school more, but now you can quantitatively measure the attendance rate of the kids coming back to the schools more, not because they are fascinated by the lights, but because their parents want them to go back and get the lights charged so that they have lights in the evening. Now that's a fascinating fact that only comes around if you engage with the community to a very detailed quantitative level. And it might be a silly study in a lot of academic sense and might not get me published anywhere, but I don't care about that. But the reality about it is it does help us sell our solar lamps to really interior villages who've never seen electricity, and also have an additional secondary benefit of a kid coming to school, whereas his parents never had that value to education in the first place. So that's my take, not to support the cause of randomized controlled trials, which I feel I've mastered over the past 3 years without really understanding what they meant. But the fact is, it helps from a commercial perspective.
That's good. So, what are the other benefits of this sort of engagement, Rustam? Right? I mean, one is obviously as you point out, it's understanding the consumer, it's getting the kind of the sort of marketing data that you need to actually run your business. But you're also engaged not just in selling a product to people in rural UP. You also are a social enterprise in Delhi. You have to interact with governments, you have to interact with donors, investors, and so on. How does interacting with researchers who are doing this kind of work help you in the other half, so to speak, of your business?
Yeah, so 2 quick points. Number one is external credibility that you draw. So I have dragged Johannes to meetings with ministers, just because, not that anybody really communicated that well with each other, but the fact is just to show that whatever Booth is doing has a stamp of approval or credibility from a third party who doesn't have a financial interest in our success. So I think that's very important and very critical for social enterprises which are doing stuff that others have written off. The second is also in terms of who does research for smaller companies. So when we were a startup in 2012 and Johannes came in and said we're going to do the study, he wrote a check for 5,000 and we were dancing for a long time. The reason is because I had no research funds. Whatever money we would get from these conventional grants would be tied to actual implementation. So in the end of the day, you'd get money, you'd set something up, and you'd have to leave. You would not really be able to capitalize on your understanding of that area. I think that was crucial because that little amount of money and a professor coming down, desperate to learn Hindi for whatever reasons, and hanging around in Uttar Pradesh, understanding would give us a whole research perspective credibility, which is helping us now. So I think that's very important for us.
I just want to, ask Johannes about this. You sort of alluded to that, the process of learning. But what are the challenges of doing this work, right? There's all the sort of standard. There are 2 kinds of challenges. One is operational, which is how do you set it up, and the second is kind of intellectual, which is the challenge of getting your sample right, getting your sampling frame, getting your response rates, making sure that your sample is balanced. I mean, a whole bunch of challenges that may not necessarily encounter when you're calling people on the phone in BC, but you will encounter in rural India. So the aspect of operationally working on such questions, but also the sort of intellectual challenge of setting up the experiment.
So the operational challenge is certainly quite major in these studies because you have to do things, and that adds a lot of sort of dimensions and aspects that are not there if you just analyze existing data. So one of them is just starting with very basic things like institutional review boards here in the United States or Canada, where we have to get these ethics approvals. That's obviously a completely legitimate system, but the amount of time that can sometimes go into explaining to these bureaucrats who have never been to India sort of what we are doing and why it's okay and how it's not illegal and nobody's going to die often takes very significant amounts of work and time. It also creates delays. When you then combine that with, you often need these partners, right? Whether it's a government agency or a company or a civil society organization, you have to collaborate with them. They have many other things to do. They are pressed for time. They might have different views. They might not always understand why it is important to randomize. Why cannot we just go and give the lanterns to the people who need it the most? All these things will add up to a very complicated interaction, which is not something that kind of a PhD in economics or political science prepares you for, right? For that, you would need to do something very different, some administrative experience, and so on. And it also links then to the intellectual one, because if you spend a lot of time doing this operational management, that's sort of my life. I'm kind of an uncompensated CEO most of my time. I do the painful work without the stock options. That leaves not a lot of space for thinking, right? Because you mostly just put out fires, and then when it comes to, okay, so how should we really sample this, or what is the best way to do this intervention, you just don't have the time to do that. And that, I think, requires just a lot of time in the field. So you have to understand, if I go to a household in Unnao, for example, how will they react to this? If you've never been there, if you haven't spent a lot of time talking to these people, you really have no idea, because the culture is so different, the expectations are so different, people's views of basic things. A sort of very normal thing to do here, for example, could I talk to your wife in rural Indian context in many places, people would look, why would you want to do that? What are you after? Is this some scam or something like that? So you have to be prepared for things like this. And that just means that you have to spend a lot of time going there again and again and again. And a lot of these experiments fail. One of the things I've tried to do in my career is try to publish the failed experiments as well. It's very hard because the reviewers in academia want to see flashy big things. Whether they're true or not is not as important as that they sound exciting and make you feel sort of warm inside. So if you have an experiment that failed, people say, you made some mistakes in the study, we don't want to see this paper. And that really results in a very biased understanding. We are now kind of living through an era where people are replicating earlier studies and finding that, guess what, eating meat doesn't actually make you selfish, right? Or living in exactly, that's how crazy that study was. Peer-reviewed, thousands of citations. Or working in a messy office doesn't make you discriminate against minorities. Another psychology study of that is not true at all. So I think all these things, when you add it up, it really is this kind of muddling through an incremental progress. Which is sometimes a little depressing when you think of how much work goes into one study.
And so how is collective knowledge moved forward then?
I think the way it moves forward is really that we try to do these studies, and every now and then we do a kind of a stock-taking exercise. It can be very systematic, so it could be a kind of a meta-review, which is what meta-analysis, what people in the health sciences do. It could be something a little less systematic, which is somebody writes up a 5-pager saying, I took a look at all the experiments. Here's what I found. And we've also found some sort of new ways to deal with this. There are these things, for example, now people recommend that either you should publicly register your design in advance so that you cannot go and p-hack or fish for results, or alternatively you should use some of these techniques where you, for example, randomly choose half of your sample, you run the study, then you do the same thing with the other sample. And if you see some really weird things happening between these two randomly chosen samples, you probably have a small sample problem or something like that. So I think we are, as a collective, we are becoming better at this, but it's a long way to go. And just one more thing to say about this is these are very complicated issues, right? So in the medical sciences, you see this big difference in the quality of the research between studies that just test whether a medicine works and studies that try to figure out if, for example, drinking coffee is bad for you. The medicine studies are pretty straightforward. You take a bunch of people who have a health problem, you give to half of them a pill and to the other half a placebo, and you see what happens. But trying to figure out if drinking coffee is good for you is extremely difficult because it's really hard to force people who don't like drinking coffee to drink coffee, right? So there you see that as the problems become complicated and cultural and social, it just really is hard to make progress. And I think we should have these sort of realistic expectations about how long and how much work it takes to figure this out.
Rustam, in your domain of this question, what sorts of challenges, so just reflecting back on Johannes' question, what are the sorts of challenges that you encounter? I mean, writ large, not just in the field, but also in terms of running a business like this.
Well, after hearing Johannes, my problems seem very small. We just try to sell very expensive stuff to people who don't even have $2. But in reality, I think one of the primary problems on the ground Johannes mentioned, but I just repeat, is the understanding the customer. For us, it's a customer. It's not a beneficiary. It's not a subject anymore. So while I sit with all of you, I still like to put my phrase in there. A customer is somebody who pays you for something and sees value in a product. To me, that is the biggest, highest, most satisfaction of a result delivered. Whether it's published or not, unfortunately, I don't care. In reality, that is very difficult to do if you don't understand them properly. So I think that's the first challenge we encounter when we do these kinds of research, is the researcher comes from a very westernized setup who needs to be educated on, not educated in the formal sense, but who needs to be immersed into the understanding of this zone. And I think that's why some of the experiments we've done have taken a longer time than necessary. It's just that the questions had to be reframed continuously. Questions are also have to be not just reframed but rephrased in the sense of how direct you can be with a particular culture, what you can ask and all. But other than that, coming back away from the field, also as a company like ours of this setup, the bigger challenge is justifying to our investors sometimes why we need to do these research. Why somebody, we have like, out of a company of maybe 60, 70 odd people, maybe 10 people who speak English who can talk properly to researchers and post PhDs and smart people. But why should we take away their time from better utilized stuff, which is actually paid by the investors, to do these kinds of futuristic study? Third, very importantly, a company like ours is also trying to build competitive advantage for ourselves in very business terms. We set up the microgrids, we ensure that not many other people can come into these areas. How much of the information should be let out in public? What we should talk about? Now you see a meter, it looks very simple. It's a patented technology. We hold a patent for it. So some of it is also like, how much do you share from a business perspective? You want to do good for the entire society, and you do understand the industry needs to get better, and work like what Johannes is doing or you are doing or all the academics are doing is important. But you also don't want to become like a non-profit and release all your trade secrets. I think that's a conundrum we always face. And I mean, I guess in the beginning I was a lot more selfish, probably drinking a lot more coffee or whatever. But over the period of, now we realize we become more, open with our information and stuff. So I think those are the challenges we face. Financial challenges are always there. I mean, somebody will just land up and say, I want to see a village. I mean, this is not poverty tourism I run, right? Seriously. You have to have a specific plan, and we've become super anal about it. You have to have a plan. We need to understand the study that you're doing. We need to see the merit of it. And you also have to tell us your deliverable, the end results. It just can't be a bunch of people want to experience Indian countryside. So I think those are the challenges which are sometimes hard to communicate as well. And it's not because we want to be obnoxious about it. It's just because we have to respect the time of the customer. Because we spend 15 minutes with them, we have to extract that 10 rupees from them, and that makes our living. And that has to be respected. No amount of subsidization, all that you're saying, you're paying extra and all that, is actually going to prove real valuable to me. So I think that's a balancing act for companies like us.
So can you reflect a little bit more broadly on the very idea of social enterprise? So what do social enterprises do? Because you have experience in running one in a particular context, but I just want you to take a step back and sort of, what is the role of a social enterprise in the development?
So yesterday, if people who were there in the other talk, Milan trashed all the cook stoves. So today is the turn of social enterprises.
I'm just asking a question.
But well, it is a funny word. Social and enterprise are inevitably putting, capitalism and socialism in the same bucket, which is an oxymoron in a term. We said we are a social enterprise because I had to answer it so many times to all investors and everybody. We said 3 reasons. Number 1, the community that we deal with, period. I could have sold solar, or we sold, one of our divisions sells solar to the extreme rich people who set up power plants in houses in Delhi or in factories. But the reason we will say this part of our business is social enterprise is because, number 1, the community we deal with. You could make far more profits not dealing with this way. Second, the product you deal with. Very clearly defined. I could sell chewing tobaccos and become a multi-billionaire. Seriously, I would have an endowment fund for the whole university. That's how rich people get. I could do diamond, people, whoever follows Indian media, there's a guy who was selling diamonds who walked off with $3 billion. So there's far more money doing a different kind of product. Solar business is really complicated. It's just stupid. You set up a panel, for the first 10 days, people will just watch and say like, oh, there has to be a wire coming in from somewhere. How can a panel of glass actually generate power? So these are some simple things. And number 3, it's also the commitment of the senior leadership or the vision about how you channelize the profits that come in. These are very 3 short, clear definitions. I have not written a paper on them, but they're very crisp and dirty. Who you sell to, what you sell, and what you do with your profits defines us as a social enterprise. I hope that answers your question. Otherwise, I can also.
No, but also
we have some marketing videos if you want.
No, but just a sense for, governments deliver development programs, foundations do it, right? This is a whole different. So what role the social enterprise?
If you break up that word, so first part is social. So that's all this. Right. The enterprise is a very strict enterprise. We have not taken grant funding. We took equity funding and we raised debt, which means that we have to give back the money, which means that while we have a great time with all these work, if we don't sell stuff, we don't. Second, when we do say enterprise, we also have a commitment of servicing to the last mile. I think that's where the governments and the non-profits have fallen grossly in short. And for your cook stove issue, I'm not raising it, one of the biggest issue was the lack of service infrastructure. They were just thousands, and we sold, well, we threw away 1,500 cook stoves ourselves because we wanted to get into the hot business. But we realized there would be a truck and they would just deliver. And there would be no servicing infrastructure. There would be no local technical expertise built in to manage or communicate the effectiveness of this technology. So when you say enterprise, you've got to do all that because you're not treating a beneficiary, you're not giving it out for free. They have to pay. With the microgrids, it's even deeper and harder because you are putting the capital in and you're waiting every month for them to make a payment. So that transforms sort of the culture of the company completely. It makes you it makes you put on a suit and not a kurta, in short, for people who know. It's really, really important to have a very corporate way of working. And the investors expect that. We all perform like that. So I think it's very important. It's very hard balancing both of them. And for companies like Boon, what we've ensured is we have a vertical which makes a lot of money, which does a lot of bigger scale power plant, and we have a vertical which does work where we can afford to lose money. And it's balancing all that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Should we open it up to questions? We have, I
think about 20.
10 or so minutes. 10, 15 minutes. Jay? Oh, students first, sorry. No student questions? All right. Oh, Pushali.
So the Indian government, I can speak for the Indian government, does have subsidies for solar. We do access them, but there is a difficulty in getting the subsidies. So it's not an open, easy access market. But technically there are. We as a company have always worked with the government. So we partnered with the government in different schemes. The Saubhagya scheme, for example, the implementers will be enterprises. So, the people who will set up the systems or the people who will do the servicing will be companies. There will be either a capital subsidy or there will be an interest rate subsidy on a loan that you take. So both of them do exist. Now again, in India, policy is great, implementation is always harder. So getting the subsidies is an art. So it took us, 4-5 years to figure out how to get the subsidies. So for early stage companies, it's harder, but there are enough. And I advise every entrepreneur to work with the government. Unlike Africa, where you could go in with a lot of donor funds and do a lot of work, in India you can't. India, Pakistan, Nepal, you can't.
So I want to know how you guys navigate the frictions of conflicts. So I realize that your business partner, you're not always aligned with his brand. So this could manifest as you want to run a flow condition, and you can't hold on one customer and say myself and freedom. Or you want to run this treatment, you say can't do that with customers. Or you got to remove the treatment to examine the longevity of the effect. You say, no, we can't just take that away from the customer now. Or you want to measure some other data. Because I've experienced this, somebody who runs SAPs like we do. And I'm running into those like here with my partner who just kind of has their own boundaries and agenda. And sometimes they're in conflict. So what are your experiences in how
So first of all, I would say that working with Boon has always been one of the easiest experiences we've had with these enterprises, social or not, in the sense that I think Rustam's team has always been very engaged with these studies from early on, and I think the key thing is always to agree in advance what we are going to do, and then stick to that. If we agree that this is the treatment, then that is the treatment, unless there is some real emergency that makes it impossible to continue. And not to leave it kind of open and then start fighting after $100,000 have been burned, so whether we can keep the treatment or not. So this is the one thing that's made our life much easier. Some of the other partners, no names mentioned here, but have been sort of much less engaged until we publish a result that shows that something doesn't work. And at that point they get very upset and start accusing me of being a kind of a terrible person and destroying their livelihoods and all that. So that hasn't happened with Boon. Whenever we've shown that what they do doesn't work, they've always taken it in kind of good spirits and said like let's do better next time. So it's actually been quite an easy experience for us. Maybe
Thanks for
Rustam's
the
a different
we actually do 100 things bad, so if 5 things don't work because of him, doesn't matter that much. But in a sense, I think that we have now partnerships with maybe 11 different institutions. That framing and structuring your research early enough is very important. Also ensuring from our side that there is a point of contact or a person who is overseeing that research is important. But to the philosophical, so conflicts about control groups, which is a big pain point, we still have that. So what we do as a business is push it that there has to be some monetization involved for us to leave that. Now I'm saying it in a very capitalistic way. So if there is this villages that I'm not supposed to touch, then there should be some payment coming to me for not touching it. Now in a philosophical way, that's bad because those people still don't get the benefit. But from a company perspective, I don't go at a loss by not entering those villages. So I think it's very important to also make these points very clear that as an enterprise, they will engage with you only if the bottom line is something that makes sense. Do not expect enterprises to bend over backwards with great studies when there is a big control group that they cannot touch because that's a market they cannot address. So if some professor comes and says, oh, you cannot touch these 10 villages, they are neighbor to your villages, exactly same profile. I'm not stupid, I'm not going to touch them. Of course I'm going to touch them. I'm in the business of selling my products. And if I have the same kind of people, I will only not touch them, honestly, if you monetize me for not touching them. And I'm being very honest and blunt about it and probably obnoxious, but that's how business people will think. The papers and all come very later and the feedback is great. Often enough, during the engagement process, we understand the mistakes we are making as well. So by the time the paper comes out with Johannes, we always understand, oh my God, this experiment was a bad one. And Johannes is going to burn us. So we are prepared that, there'll be multiple conferences where they'll be like, oh, Bool did something very stupid. But then again, you have to do 10 stupid things to run a company. But I think we always forget in terms of research is about the financial aspect when you engage with communities, even with NGOs, non-profits. You call them, you want to have chai pani, you want to have tea with them. But you expect them to leave their jobs and give you all your focus group information. But you don't want to pay them anything. How does that work in any other context? If I ask Milind, sorry, not picking it up, that give me 3 hours of your time, I'll probably get a $4,000 bill or something like that, right?
At least. He's giving a discount.
But the problem is we assume that we are doing good and that allows us to be intrusive is not a good assumption. We walk into people's houses. I have had this silly thing. People walk in and they'll say, put on this light. Now put on that light, now put on that fan, now switch it off, now switch. I mean, come on. If somebody walks into somebody's house in Canada and starts saying all these things to get data, you'll probably call the police. But just because he's in the village, people are intrusively going in and out, and then they'll take out their little chocolate or a biscuit packet and say, oh, no, you have this biscuit, little boy. I mean, come on. Seriously, give me a break. Sorry. But I'm just saying be respectful for the time and the money and always compensated with the money, So, sorry about that.
Two-part. One is actually addressing the next question of whether there is of course, you're expanding your business, so you get to do places and see the how much edge do you get as you expand? That's the first part. The second part is what is the barrier to growing your capacity?
So India, the barriers are 3 kinds. One is geographical. So as an energy access business, I can't speak for as an energy access business, microgrids have a certain kind of demographic in terms of the geography that we need. So in Rajasthan, for example, it's sparse population with undulating terrain, where microgrids don't work because I can't draw DC wires like that. In UP, it works very well because it's congested population. So geography is number 1. Number 2 is income capacity. It's very different. Also the kind of income people have. So again, in Uttar Pradesh, they are migrant laborers working in these small cities, or they are agricultural farmers, or they are milk cattle owners. In Rajasthan, very different. So again, somebody gets paid in 3 months, somebody gets paid in a month. So it affects us a lot, and these researchers too. And number 3 is also the distance from the closest infrastructure point. For example, the government, Anganwadis or whatever, panchayats or whatever. And they're all different in different places in India, unfortunately. So unfortunately, while I say I'm doing very well in India, we're actually doing very well in UP. The good part is it's 200 million people. So it's like 3 times of Canada, so I'm pretty happy about it. But it's still a state which has a cultural, geographical, and demographic identity. Similar with your research, I'm sure. I mean, can you translate your research to another state?
Some cases, yes. Depends a lot also on. It often tends to be the case that neighboring states share some similarities. So if we do some research in Uttar Pradesh, there's a decent chance that it works in Bihar or Madhya Pradesh. If we then go to Kashmir or Kerala, we see a different story and it probably doesn't translate. So it's kind of a gradient. The farther you go, at some point it's just going to break down.
Terry went down.
I'm just curious about the quantity too. I mean, if you had to put on the table what you do for this extraction or the Canada wants to use
So in terms of uptake, I think it's in the end quite a simple story. So you need to have an affordable product so people who don't have a lot of disposable income are able to pay for it. And they are able to pay for it in a way that is kind of convenient and understandable. So you don't want to ask for the massive down payments or sort of complicated contracts that you sign, and you want to have some kind of simple way of allowing people to spend money on this. And then the second thing is the quality of the service, so implementation, right? Many of these companies go in promising that we are going to give you very large amounts of energy anytime, 24/7. But if the reality is that the company has serious problems with maintenance and dealing with all these issues, that's going to immediately result in this interesting pattern of disadoption. So what we've seen is that people take on a service like this and start paying for it, and 6 months later they say, I've had enough, I'm paying all this money, I'm not getting any service. So it's not just the initial adoption, but keeping the customer, which turns out to be a major challenge for many of these companies.
For us, the bigger challenge is when we design a product, the input that we get from the community is very different from when it's actually being used. So what tends to happen in the case of microgrids is you tend to oversize what you're doing. So, and we face that initially. So while we love to service stuff, but after a point, if it doesn't make sense to service it, that's when you don't do it. But often we felt that you ask a person in a survey where he's not paying, you ask him, oh, we'll watch TV for 3 hours, we'll do this, we will run a motor, we will do this, we'll do that. And when we were naive, or we are still naive, but when we were more naive, we would design it according to what they would tell us. And then, but one of the studies I think you've seen is they are quite happy if you go and ask them, but they're using very less of electricity. We start thinking in our terms that, oh, if I had another blender, I would probably use it to blend. But they are not thinking that terms, and that burnt us quite a bit because we have capital invested in all these places. So I think in terms of microgrids, it's very important to get that design right or keep it very modular.
Ron, last question.
My experience with the ethics side of things has been mostly quite positive. I haven't had any difficulties with this, and I think the reason is that, like Rustam was saying, for the companies it's a fairly simple thing. Will this help us make money or not? And you just negotiate in advance in a way that the company kind of at least breaks even and ideally makes a little bit of profit. It could be that you basically pay for them for not doing anything in a village, or you help them collect some data that they need. You agree on these things, you have a clear understanding of what the sort of rules of publication is. The company is not allowed to kind of stop you from publishing. You just agree these things in advance. And then of course you also want to make sure that there's no conflict of interest. So for example, I would not do an impact assessment of Bund if I owned some Bund stocks, right? Then that would be a terrible thing to do. So I think these things are not, in my experience, so challenging. Where they become really difficult, I think, is if you don't actually know as an academic what's happening in the field, right? So you have a company that is doing something, and then later you find that the company is actually abusing their customers or using very questionable means to collect payments, or they have some criminal connections, they're taking bribes, which is not unusual in many of the places where you have an energy access problem. So that's where it starts to get, when you get the sort of criminal or kind of dark element, then it becomes really complicated, because you have an ongoing study, you have an agreement, you have a funder who is basically told you that I need to see the results by December. You go to the funder and say, well, it turns out the guy is a gangster, I didn't realize this. What do you do then? Then it becomes difficult and complicated.
And he didn't encounter that problem.
Well, on that note, thank you guys for a great discussion.